We like to think we're alone when no one's in the room. We carry this idea around that solitude is real, that our thoughts are private, that our actions, especially the small ones, go unnoticed. But that's not the case. In fact, the illusion of privacy is one of the most dangerous assumptions we hold in the modern world. It's not just a technological issue, though that plays a large role. It's a psychological vulnerability, a philosophical blind spot we've inherited in an age that tells us we're free, autonomous, and unobserved. Let's start with the obvious. The devices we use, the apps we scroll through, the cameras on our laptops and the microphones in our pockets. These are not inert tools. They're extensions of a surveillance apparatus so sophisticated that we can't see it precisely because it's designed to be invisible. And I'm not talking about some vague Orwellian fantasy. I mean the cold, hard infrastructure that records your preferences, tracks your movement, listens to your voice, maps your relationships, and builds a psychological profile of you in real time, minute by minute. You're giving that data away freely, casually, often enthusiastically. Why? Because we've been conditioned to trade convenience for control. That's the bargain we've struck, and most people aren't even aware they're making it. But this goes deeper than surveillance capitalism, much deeper, because beyond the hardware, there's a psychological observer at work, one that isn't just watching, but internalized. You see, when we know or even suspect that someone is watching us, we start to modify our behavior, not always consciously, subtly, quietly. Maybe you didn't post that opinion. Maybe you water it down. Maybe you hesitate before searching for something that might seem controversial. Or maybe you stop asking questions altogether because the act of questioning itself feels risky. That's a profound transformation of the self, and it happens beneath the surface. Now, imagine this effect not just as a momentary shift, but as a chronic condition, a constant state of self-surveillance internalized over years. That's what's happening. And it creates a fractured self, a person divided between who they are and who they feel they need to appear to be. Over time, that gap widens. The authentic self gets buried. We start living for the watcher, whoever or whatever he is. That watcher, by the way, doesn't have to be a government or a corporation or even another person. Philosophically and psychologically, it can be something archetypal. It's the I at the top of the pyramid, the superego, the voice in your head that sees everything you do and quietly passes judgment. In religious traditions, that's God. In modern culture, it's the algorithm. In your mind, it's the internal critic you picked up through years of social feedback. And once that presence becomes real to you, even if only subconsciously, you are never alone again. The result? We become people who live under the gaze of something we can't name but still obey. We censor ourselves. We limit ourselves. We edit our lives, not because we've done something wrong, but because the idea of being truly seen as we are terrifies us. And so privacy becomes more than a legal or technological issue. It becomes a spiritual one, a question of who you are when no one is watching and whether that version of you still exists at all. You're not as alone as you think, and the more you believe you are, the more power the watcher gains. So the first step is this: become aware, see the gaze, not to run from it, but to understand it, because only when you can name the watcher can you begin to reclaim the self he's been watching all along. Let's talk about footprints, not the kind you leave in the sand, but the ones you leave behind every time you engage with the digital world. You see, most people treat their online activity as if it's ephemeral, like smoke, like it disappears into the void once the page is closed or the device is turned off. But that's not how it works. The truth is, every action you take online is recorded somewhere, and those records don't just vanish, they accumulate, they stack, they begin to tell a story, and over time that story starts to resemble you with alarming accuracy. Now we tend to think of our digital trail as a passive byproduct. You Google something, you like a post, you watch a video, innocent enough, right? But what you don't realize is that those actions are signals, tiny indicators of your interests, your values, your fears, your desires. And when billions of those signals are fed into complex machine learning models, those systems begin to predict you, not just what you'll click on next, but what you might believe in 5 years, who you might vote for, whether you're likely to change jobs, or even if you're at risk of a mental health crisis. That should stop you cold. Because what we're dealing with here is a digital mirror that reflects more than your behavior. It reflects who you are becoming. And worse, it can start to shape that very process. Is a psychological dimension to this that people don't talk about enough. Human beings have always left traces behind. We've always been observed by others in our communities, by family, friends, society. But that kind of observation had limits. It was bounded by time, proximity, and memory. Digital footprints are not bound by any of those things. They don't fade. They don't forget. They don't forgive. That means your worst day, your dumbest joke, your most impulsive reaction. It's all there, accessible, permanent, searchable, and more importantly, interpretable by systems that don't know you but think they do. Now, think about what that does to the psyche. When you know or suspect that your past self is always present, always retrievable, you begin to feel watched by your own history. That's a form of existential pressure. You become reluctant to act freely in the present because you're chained to a past that never dies. The self in that case becomes a fossil trapped in digital amber. And here's the real kicker. Those footprints aren't just being stored. They're being weaponized commercially, politically, even socially. The version of you that the data suggests is then sold back to you in the form of targeted content, personalized ads, filtered news, curated feeds. It's a feedback loop. The more they know, the more they influence. The more they influence, the more predictable you become, until eventually you're not making choices, you're having choices made for you, and you're simply following the script. That's a dangerous place to be, because once you lose the sense that your thoughts are your own, once you feel like your desires might be manufactured, you begin to question your agency, you become passive, and that's where the real loss occurs, not in privacy, but in sovereignty. The ability to govern yourself, to decide freely and consciously what you believe, what you value, and how you want to live. So what do? You pay attention. You act deliberately. You become the kind of person who is aware of the trail you leave and who refuses to let that trail define or confine them, because you are not your data. You are not your history. You are something deeper, more complex, more sacred than anything an algorithm could ever capture. Let's consider something fundamental, how your behavior changes when you know you're being watched. This is not a trivial observation. It's actually one of the most powerful psychological levers in human existence. If you introduce the presence of an observer, even a perceived observer, people act differently. It's immediate, it's unconscious, it's deeply human. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. But when the sense of being watched becomes constant, pervasive, and ambiguous, something shifts. Something serious. Imagine a security camera in the corner of a room. You walk in and maybe you straighten your posture, you avoid certain gestures, you act with a bit more restraint. Why? Because someone might be watching, you might be recorded. And that idea influences how you present yourself. Now multiply that subtle effect by the scale of modern surveillance. It's not one camera, it's not one person. No, it's every app, every search, every message, every facial recognition scan in a crowded city, every metadata point that gets cross-referenced with every other. You're not just being observed, you're being modeled. And here's the psychological depth of it. This kind of observation doesn't just shape what you do, it shapes who you become. When people feel watched continuously, they begin to perform. They act according to perceived expectations. They aim to be liked, not to be true. Over time, this performance displaces authenticity. You lose track of what you actually think or feel and instead adopt the persona that seems safest, or most rewarded, or least likely to be targeted. This is something Michel Foucault talked about when he described the panopticon, a theoretical prison design where a central watchtower can observe all the inmates, but the inmates can't tell whether they're being watched at any given moment. The result, they assume they're always being watched, and so they regulate their own behavior. The genius of the system is that actual observation becomes unnecessary. It's self-enforced. That's the power of constant observation. It doesn't need to be real to be effective. It just needs to be believed. Now, apply that to your life. Every time you post, you're curating. Every time you check how many likes you've received, you're measuring your social worth against an invisible standard. Every time you hesitate to say something you believe because it might cost you status, connection, or opportunity, you're yielding not to truth, but to the gaze of the other. And the tragedy is, the other may not even exist in any concrete way. It could be a faceless algorithm, a distant audience, or an imagined critic, but the effect is real, and the consequence is conformity at the cost of authenticity. Let's be clear, human beings need some level of observation. We're social creatures, we refine ourselves through feedback, but when surveillance becomes ambient, endless, and impersonal, it stops being feedback and starts being control. It erodes the space where personal growth, private thought, and moral courage are supposed to take root. That space shrinks, it disappears. And when that happens, we don't just lose privacy, we lose freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the deeper freedom. The freedom to wrestle with complexity without fear, to make mistakes without permanent record, to develop a soul without being constantly scored or sold. So what's the answer? It starts with this. Recognize the watcher within. Understand how your own sense of being watched is shaping your life. And then begin to resist. Not through rebellion, but through clarity. Say what you mean. Do what matters, live as though truth were the only algorithm worth answering to. Because the real danger isn't that someone is watching you, it's that you might start living only for the watcher. It's not just that you're being watched, that would be troubling enough. It's that the watcher is actively shaping you, nudging your thoughts, tilting your preferences, steering your behavior without you ever realizing that it's happening. That's where this conversation goes from unsettling to profound. Because it's one thing to be observed, but it's quite another to be guided without your consent, slowly, subtly, and most dangerously with your participation. You don't click on something randomly, you're shown a curated feed. You don't see the same internet as the person sitting next to you. Your results are filtered, your options tailored, you think you're choosing, but the choice has already been shaped long before your finger ever hovers over the screen. That's influence masquerading as autonomy, and it's become so common that we no longer question it. Now, here's the psychological twist. The mind conforms to the environment it's immersed in. If you're exposed to a particular type of content, over and over, angry content, seductive content, tribal content, you begin to think in those patterns. Your emotional responses are conditioned, your assumptions shift, your moral intuitions become warped, not because you've reasoned your way there, but because your mind is adapting to the algorithmic architecture of your world. And don't forget, these systems aren't evil, they're not conspiring against you, they're simply designed to maximize engagement. That's the goal. Keep you scrolling, keep you watching, keep you reacting. And what engages you most is usually what disturbs you most. What triggers outrage, jealousy, fear, or self-doubt. That's the irony. These systems exploit your own cognitive vulnerabilities to hold your attention. And in the process, they quietly rewire how you perceive reality. You become more anxious, more tribal, more certain of your side, less curious about the other, and you don't even realize that it's happening. Think about the implications. Your attention, arguably the most precious resource you possess, is being harvested, not for knowledge, not for wisdom, but for data. And in exchange, you're offered convenience, personalized playlists, targeted ads, seamless interfaces. But the cost isn't just time, it's identity, it's agency, because when your preferences are being fed back to you in a closed loop, you stop growing. You stop encountering the unfamiliar. You stop choosing from a place of freedom and start reacting from a place of habit. This is where philosophy matters. Plato warned about this in the allegory of the cave. The prisoners stare at the shadows on the wall and mistake them for reality, never realizing they are being shown a constructed version of the world. The only way out is to turn around and confront the source of the projection. And that's what's required now. Not a rejection of technology, but a confrontation with how it's shaping your inner world. You need to become the kind of person who questions why you believe what you believe, who notices what you're shown and asks who benefits from you believing it. That takes effort. It takes discomfort. It takes standing against the inertia of ease. But that's the price of freedom, not the political kind, the psychological kind, the kind that allows you to think clearly in a world designed to keep you distracted. So here's the truth. If you aren't actively choosing what shapes your mind, then something or someone else is doing it for you. The watcher isn't just observing, he's programming. And unless you become aware of the code, you'll live by it without ever knowing who wrote it. On one level, yes, he is the algorithm, the surveillance state, the data collector. That's the material reality. But on a deeper reality, he's also a symbol, a representation of something more fundamental, the persistent gaze that defines your behavior, your morality, your self-concept. The watcher is the father figure, the inner critic, the superego. He's the part of your psyche that stands outside you, observing and evaluating, even when no one else is in the room. Freud understood this. He talked about the superego as the internalized voice of authority. First your parents, then society, then culture. That voice doesn't just tell you what's right and wrong. It watches, it judges, and it does so relentlessly. It can become tyrannical. And unless you learn to differentiate between that voice and your authentic conscience, you'll mistake the anxiety of being watched for the voice of truth. That's dangerous. It breeds shame, it breeds repression, and worse, it leads to a life where your actions are dictated not by what's meaningful, but by what's approved. In religious language, this idea appears everywhere. The all-seeing eye, the omnipresent judge, God as the ultimate observer. And whether you believe in God or not, the structure remains relevant. The idea of being watched from beyond by something greater, something moral, something you can't deceive, is hardwired into our traditions, and it served a purpose. It was meant to orient people toward virtue, toward integrity, toward living in alignment with truth, even when no one else is watching. But here's the twist. In the modern world, we've replaced that moral gaze with a technological one. Instead of being watched by something that calls us to be better, we're now being watched by systems that want us to be predictable. That's a profound shift. The divine watcher asked, "Are you living rightly?" The algorithmic watcher asks, "Are you maximizing engagement?" And that's not a neutral difference. It changes how you see yourself and what kind of person you're trying to become. And then there's the watcher in your own mind, the part of you that sees what you do and makes judgments. That part can be your ally or your enemy. If it becomes rigid, punitive, obsessed with image and control, it can crush you. But if it's developed, if it's refined by discipline and honest reflection, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes your conscience. And that's the kind of internal watcher you want to cultivate, one that sees you clearly and still calls you to stand up straighter, to tell the truth, to take responsibility for your life. So the watcher isn't just out there, he's also in here. And part of growing up psychologically, spiritually, is learning to see him clearly, to distinguish the eyes that manipulate from the eyes that guide, to understand when you're being molded into a product and when you're being formed into a person. Because if you don't recognize the watcher's many faces, you won't know which one you're obeying. And when that happens, you risk becoming a stranger to yourself, acting, performing, complying, without ever knowing why. The most dangerous watcher isn't the one who sees you, it's the one you can't see. We've talked about being watched by systems, by culture, by others, by ourselves. We've traced the effects of this constant observation on our minds, our choices, our very sense of identity. And here's the reality. You don't escape the gaze, not entirely, but you can decide how you respond to it. And this is where responsibility comes in, not as a punishment, but as a path forward. Yes? But one that restores your dignity. Because when you realize just how closely you're being watched, when you grasp that your data, your habits, your impulses are being tracked, fed back to you and used to influence your future, it's easy to become cynical, to withdraw, to resign yourself to passivity. You might think it's too much, it's too late, I can't fight this. But that's exactly what the system wants you to believe. A resigned individual is an easily guided individual. He doesn't resist, he doesn't ask questions, he doesn't grow, he just consumes, reacts, and repeats. And that's why responsibility is not optional. It's the antidote to surveillance-induced apathy. When you take responsibility for your attention, for your thoughts, for your words, especially when no one else is making you, you begin to regain agency. You reclaim your ability to act in the face of pressure. You reintroduce moral weight to your decisions. You start by noticing when you're being manipulated, noticing how your habits are being shaped, noticing when you're drifting into performance instead of truth. That kind of self-observation is powerful, but it's only the beginning. The next step is alignment, bringing your actions into congruence with what you actually believe, not what earns you the most approval. That's hard. It requires courage, but it's the only way to resist the subtle tyranny of the watcher. There's a deeper reason for this too, something more philosophical. The world needs people who are awake, people who don't just float with the current of convenience, but who stand against it when it drifts toward falsehood or nihilism. The watched society thrives on mediocrity, on the flattening of human character. It wants predictability, not integrity. And yet, the only kind of individual who can resist that is one who sees the cost of complacency and chooses responsibility anyway. And maybe most of all, it means remembering that you are not just someone being watched. You are someone capable of watching back, of stepping out of unconscious patterns, of seeing clearly and acting intentionally, even in the presence of 1,000 invisible eyes.